long before maps were drawn along the northern coastlines of Scotland, Ireland, and the Faroe Islands, the people who lived closest to the sea carried stories that no chart could ever record. These were stories of creatures that existed between two worlds, beings who were neither fully of the sea nor fully of the land. They were graceful in the water, hauntingly human on the shore, and they left behind legends that endured for centuries. These were the Selkies. Welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, if you enjoy what we do here, exploring the myths and legends of the ancient world, it means a great deal to us when you subscribe and follow along. Each episode takes a great deal of research, and your support is what keeps these stories alive. Now, let us begin. At their most essential, Selkies were supernatural beings of dual nature, creatures who lived in the sea as ordinary seals, but when they came ashore and shed their sealskins, revealed a fully human form beneath. Graceful, beautiful, and deeply sorrowful, they moved between two worlds with a freedom that no human and no ordinary animal possessed. In the sea, they were seals entirely. On the land, they were human entirely. And the thin boundary between those two lives was held together by a single object, the sealskin. Without it, they could not return to the water. In every tradition that remembered them, Selkies were treated as a kind of neighbor. Supernatural, yes, but deeply feeling, capable of love and grief and longing in ways that made their stories resonate far beyond the coastal communities where those stories were first told. They were recognized above all else for two things: their heartbreaking beauty in human form, and the tragedy that almost always followed when their world and the human world collided. Selkies were rooted in the folk mythology of the northern and western coastal traditions, primarily those of Scotland, Ireland, the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland. They belonged not to the grand, structured pantheons of formal religion, but to the oral tradition of fishing communities and coastal villages, passed down through generations of people, for whom the sea was not a backdrop, but a living presence that shaped every part of daily life. It was in that world, a world where the ocean took as much as it gave, that the Selkie legend was born and kept alive. The word Selkie itself grew naturally from the language of those communities. It came from the older Scots word selch, or selk, a plain, everyday term for the common harbor seal. Over time, the diminutive form, Selkie, meaning simply little seal, became the name most commonly used to describe these extraordinary beings, blurring the line between the animal that inspired the legend and the supernatural creature at its heart. The name shifted depending on where the story was told. In Ireland, they were known as the Ronan, from the Old Irish for little seal, or more broadly as the roan, a word that carried with it a heavier, more mournful character than its Scottish counterpart. In the Faroe Islands, the female Selkie was known by her own distinct name, Kopakonan, meaning the seal woman, a figure whose legend would become one of the most complete and devastating in all of Selkie mythology. But why did they come to the shore at all? The most common answer preserved across the folklore was the pull of the human world itself, a longing that lived inside the Selkies and could not be entirely suppressed, no matter how deeply they belonged to the sea. The shore was a liminal place, a boundary between two worlds, and the Selkies were drawn to that boundary the way the tide was drawn to the land. In the most widely recorded accounts, Selkies came ashore specifically on moonlit nights to shed their skins and dance in human form on the beach. This dancing was not incidental. It was described in the folklore as something close to necessary, a release of the human nature they carried within them that could not be expressed while they lived in the sea. On those nights, for those brief hours, they were fully human, moving freely across the sand with a joy that the stories contrasted sharply against the grief they carried when that freedom was taken from them. In other traditions, male Selkies came ashore with a more deliberate purpose, to seek out mortal women, particularly those whose lives on land had become defined by unhappiness. The shore in these stories was not simply a dancing ground, but a meeting place, a threshold where the needs of two different kinds of beings briefly aligned. And in some accounts, Selkies were said to come ashore to grieve, to sit on the rocks above the tide line and mourn in human form the losses that their seal nature could not fully express. What the tradition made consistently clear across all these reasons was that the coming ashore was always a risk. The Selkies knew this. They hid their skins carefully, they watched the darkness around them, they kept one eye always on the water, and still they came, which perhaps says more about the depth of that pull toward the human world than any legend could state directly. One of the oldest and most widely recorded explanations held that Selkies were the souls of drowned humans. According to this belief, men and women who had been taken by the sea did not simply vanish, they were transformed. Their spirits entered the bodies of seals, and they continued to move through the waters of the world in that changed form. This was a belief with particular weight in communities where the loss of family members to the ocean was not a rare tragedy, but an almost expected part of life. To see a seal watching calmly from the surf might be, in this tradition, to look into the face of someone you had once known. A second tradition, preserved especially in Orkney and Shetland, proposed something even older and stranger, that Selkies were fallen angels. When God cast certain angels out of heaven, not all of them fell to the land. Some fell into the sea, and those became the seal folk. This explanation carried a particular theological sadness. The Selkies were beings of celestial origin, condemned to a half-life in the cold waters of the north, belonging neither to the heavens they had left nor fully to the earth below. A third telling, one with particular weight in Orkney, described the Selkies as neither transformed humans nor fallen angels, but as something altogether older. A separate supernatural race that had existed alongside humanity since the earliest days of the world. In this telling, they were simply a people of the sea, ancient and self-contained, who chose on certain occasions to come ashore. And a fourth tradition, preserved along the Hebrides and western coasts of Scotland, described the Selkies' origins as the consequence of an ancient curse. A group of humans punished for some transgression against the natural or divine order, transformed permanently into seals, though they retained just enough of their former selves to shed that form on certain sacred nights, and remember, briefly, what they had once been. In County Donegal, the belief was preserved that seals were the transformed souls of inhabitants of Tir Fothuin, which is the land under the waves, a drowned realm beneath the Atlantic known from older strands of Irish tradition. This placed the Selkies within a much larger mythological world. They were not simply supernatural creatures. They were the survivors of an entire sunken civilization, a people whose world had been lost to the sea and who continued to exist within it in the only forms still available to them. When Selkies took human form, the folklore was consistent on one point above all others. They were beautiful. Female Selkies in particular were described as being among the most striking women a person could ever encounter. Dark-eyed, pale-skinned, with hair that fell like black water past their shoulders. Male Selkies were similarly remarkable. Tall, broad, gentle in expression, and carrying about them a quietness unlike anything in the ordinary world. Both were touched by a quality the stories return to again and again, a sadness subtle and permanent, as though even standing on dry land, they could still hear the sea calling them back. The eyes were the feature most often remarked upon in the folklore. They were large, soft, and deeply dark, in every way identical to the eyes of a seal. This was said to be the one detail that a careful observer might notice, even when the Selkie was fully clothed and walking among ordinary people on the shore. They were extraordinary swimmers, unnaturally so, and they were drawn instinctively and constantly to the water's edge. When a Selkie and a human had children together, those children sometimes bore the marks of their divided heritage. In the Scottish and Orkney traditions, they were described as having thin webbing between their fingers and toes, membranes that had to be carefully trimmed as the child grew. From their earliest years, these children were said to take to water with an ease that bordered on supernatural, as natural in the sea as they were on land, and sometimes more so. At the deepest level, the Selkies' sorrow came from the same place as their nature. They belonged to two worlds, and they were never fully at home in either one. When they lived in the sea as seals, the human part of their nature quietly ached for the shore. When they came ashore and took human form, the pull reversed entirely, and the sea called back to them with an insistence that never relented. This in-between nature was made even heavier by the traditions that explained their origins. For those who believed Selkies were the souls of drowned humans, the sadness was the sadness of the dead. They carried the memory of their human lives like something they could not quite set down. For those who believed Selkies were fallen angels, the grief was older still. The grief of beings who had once known something vast and luminous and had lost it entirely, condemned to the cold northern waters in a form that was neither what they had been nor what they had ever wished to become. No element of the Selkie legend held more weight than the sealskin. It was not a costume, but an intrinsic part of the Selkie's very being. Without it, the Selkie could not return to the sea, and this made the skin not simply a magical object in the stories, but a sacred one. When Selkies came ashore to take human form, they removed their skins with great care and hid them. They were always cautious, they were always watching, because they understood, with a certainty that required no explanation, that if the skin were found and taken, their freedom was gone. What made the legend so morally precise was what the skin represented. It could not be replaced, duplicated, or replicated. A Selkie could never be compelled to love a human. No spell or charm could bind them to the shore. The only way to keep a Selkie was to steal the one thing that was entirely and irreplaceably theirs. And the folklore never once suggested this was acceptable. The stealing of the skin was captivity. The stories knew it, named it, and condemned it, even when they also told it with a kind of aching tenderness. If a seal's skin was destroyed by fire, the Selkie could not survive, or in some versions of the tradition, was left in a state worse than death, trapped permanently in human form, unable to return to the sea. This was treated in the tradition as one of the most grievous acts a person could commit, and it appeared in the legends only as the deed of those already marked as villains. The Icelandic tradition also placed particular emphasis on the consequences of skin theft that extended well beyond the life of the individual who committed it. To steal a Selkie's skin was, in some accounts, to set a chain of events in motion that would not be resolved within a single generation. The wrong traveled down through family lines, and the sea kept its own accounting of what was owed. Across every tradition in which Selkies appeared, they were associated with specific powers that placed them apart from both ordinary humans and ordinary seals. The most fundamental of these was the gift of shape-shifting itself, the ability to move between seal and human form through the wearing or removing of the skin. Some Irish accounts also gave the Selkies a degree of power over the sea itself. A Selkie woman held captive on land was said to be capable of influencing weather in her distress, bringing fog along a stretch of coast, raising storms above a particular cove, or calling up a wave to wash her hidden skin back to her. This made the Irish tradition slightly more active in its portrayal of the Selkie as an agent, not purely a victim. In the Scottish tradition, male Selkies were said to carry an ability to affect the fortune of those who encountered them. A fisherman who treated a seal with respect, who released a captured one without harming it, or who passed a calm and watchful seal without offering it violence, might find his nets unusually full in the days that followed. A fisherman who harmed a seal that showed unusual stillness or intelligence might find his luck turn just as sharply the other way. Some accounts from the Hebrides and the western coast of Scotland also attributed a form of healing knowledge to the Selkies, remedies drawn from the deep sea, unknown to any human healer. In stories where a Selkie had been treated with genuine kindness by a human family, they sometimes left behind a gift of this knowledge before departing, an understanding of some property of plant or water that the family would carry forward long after the Selkie was gone. For all they carried in the way of power, the Selkies were also creatures of profound and specific vulnerability. The first and most absolute weakness was the loss of the seal skin. Without it, the Selkie was entirely stranded. What remained was a grief so comprehensive that the stories described it not as unhappiness, but as a kind of slow unraveling, a being that continued to exist, but was no longer whole. The second weakness was more subtle but equally dangerous. The Selkie could be deceived. They arrived on the shore with an openness, a lack of armor that made them vulnerable to the cruelties that humans could disguise as care. They hid their skins carefully, but they also trusted beaches, trusted dark nights, and that trust was the precise thing that the legends most often exploited. Fire was the third weakness. It appears rarely in the legends, always associated with deliberate cruelty rather than accident, and always followed by consequences severe enough to make clear that the tradition viewed it as something outside the bounds of what was permissible. To burn a seal skin was not a morally neutral act. It was the destruction of an irreplaceable self, and the stories did not forgive it. In Iceland, the tradition of the seal folk blended with the broader Norse mythological environment in ways that gave it a particular character. Icelandic accounts preserved stories of Selkies who were bound by an even stricter set of rules than those recorded in Scotland or Ireland. They could remove their skins only on certain specific nights, often tied, as Christianity spread through the islands, to the sacred calendar, Christmas Eve, Midsummer's Eve, or 13th day. On all other nights, they were seals, fully and without exception. This limitation gave the Icelandic Selkies an even more fleeting quality. They existed in human form only at the margins of the year, at the edges of time, on nights that already carried a charge of the uncanny in the tradition. The implication was clear. The Selkies did not operate according to human time. They moved to a rhythm that was older and different, and those brief, specific nights when they came ashore were moments when two worlds briefly touched rather than merged. The most widespread and enduring of all Selkie legends is the one about the Selkie wife. It existed in dozens of variations across Scotland, Ireland, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland. The details shifted, but the essential shape of the story remained intact through all of them. A man, most often a fisherman or a farmer living close to the shore, came upon a group of Selkies dancing on a beach or a rocky headland in the moonlight. The Selkies had removed their skins and left them nearby, and they moved in their human forms across the wet sand, free and unguarded. The man, concealing himself, waited until the Selkies were distracted, and then stole one of the skins. When the creatures fled back to the sea at dawn, one, a young woman, could not follow. She searched for her skin with a desperation, and finding it gone, she wept on the shore until the man appeared and offered her shelter. Unable to return to the sea, the Selkie woman eventually consented to live as the man's wife. She bore him children. She tended his home. She was, by all outward appearances, a part of the community. But she was never truly content. She was described in the tales as gazing out to sea for long, unbroken hours. One day, sometimes years after her capture, sometimes decades, the Selkie woman found her skin. It was most often discovered by one of her own children, playing in the rocks or moving through a chest or a locked box where the husband had hidden it. She put the skin on and walked into the sea without hesitation, though the sorrow of leaving her children was always present in the telling, written across every version of the story without exception. A variant preserved in several Scottish accounts gave the Selkie wife one final act before her departure. She told her children what had been done to her. She showed them where the skin had been hidden. She named the years of her captivity plainly, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. In these versions, the moral weight of the legend was placed directly and without ambiguity. The husband who had stolen the skin was not a sympathetic figure, regardless of his loneliness. In most versions of this story, the Selkie woman did not entirely abandon her children after returning to the sea. She was said to visit the shore where they played, watching from the water. Sometimes she brought fish. Sometimes she called to them softly across the waves. But she could never again take human form and walk beside them. One variation of this tale tells that half of her children remained on land, while the other half followed her into the sea. The MacCodrum clan of North Uist is believed to be descended from those who stayed behind. In Gaelic tradition, they were known as Clannic Codrum nan Ron, meaning the MacCodrums of the seals. It is said that this heritage is why MacCodrum men became great fishermen, deeply at ease on the water, even in conditions that filled other men with fear. Male Selkies occupied a different but equally significant role in the tradition. They were described as powerfully built, strikingly handsome, and in human form utterly compelling. Female Selkies was most often portrayed as a victim, but male Selkies moved through the stories with a degree of agency that set the two apart. Male Selkies are said to have a particular connection to mortal women who were unhappy in their marriages. In these stories, a Selkie would come ashore, take human form, and find his way to such a woman. The Selkie could offer a kind of tenderness and presence that the mortal world had denied her, but he always returned to the sea, and the woman was left on the shore with the memory of him and nothing else to show for it. A particular ritual was attached to the summoning of a male Selkie in some traditions. A woman who wished to call one to her went to the shoreline at high tide and shed 7 tears into the sea. This act was believed to reach across the boundary between the worlds and draw a Selkie lover from the depths. The children born of these unions between male Selkies and mortal women carried the sea in their blood. They were restless, they were drawn to the water, they were marked in ways both visible and invisible by the nature of the parent they had never fully known. The Selkies stood at the edge of the world as the people of the North understood it, half wild, half human, and wholly their own. In every tradition that remembered them, they were treated not as monsters or threats, but as neighbors of a kind, beings whose world overlapped just enough with the human world for tragedy to become possible. Thank you so much for spending time with this story today. If this episode spoke to you, please consider sharing it with someone who loves mythology, folklore, or the ancient stories of the world. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe and follow so that you never miss an episode. We will be returning soon with another entry, exploring the myths and powers of another extraordinary figure from the ancient world. Until then, may the sea be kind to you.